The night sky above the alien city was heavy with smoke and light. Thousands of glowing crystals lit the streets, but the hearts of the people were dark and silent. Fear had ruled them for too long, and tonight that fear was on full display. In the center of the great hall stood Solara, a young woman with silver skin and bright eyes. Her wrists were tied with rough iron chains, her knees weak, her breath shallow. Two guards pulled her forward, while the crowd watched in silence. No one spoke, no one dared, for everyone knew what would happen next. The floor before her was like a nightmare made real. Sharp spears were fixed upward, hundreds of them, polished so bright that they reflected her face. This was the punishment. The cruel tradition of the rulers. Those accused of crimes were forced to sit on the spear-covered floor. Few survived more than a few minutes, and Solara was accused, though she had done no crime. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I am innocent," but her words disappeared in the large chamber, swallowed by fear. The rulers sat on their golden thrones above, watching with cold eyes. They did not care if she was guilty or innocent. They only cared that the people stayed silent, and punishing her would keep that silence. Solara closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered her home, her father's farm, the smell of soil, the laughter of her younger brother. She remembered a time when she believed the rulers cared, when she believed there was fairness. But that belief had died the moment she spoke out. She had dared to say that the rulers were cruel, and for that single truth she was marked as guilty. The guards pressed her shoulders down, forcing her closer to the spears. Her legs trembled, her body shook, her skin almost touching the sharp points. The crowd turned their heads away. Mothers pulled their children close, fathers clenched their fists but did not move. They wanted to help, but fear was stronger than love. Everyone had seen what happened to those who resisted, and so they stayed, quiet, letting the cruelty continue. Solara's heart raced, her lips trembled as she whispered again, "I did nothing." The guards laughed under their helmets, amused by her pain. The rulers leaned forward, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They enjoyed this, the power, the control, the way fear spread like fire in dry grass. For them, every cry, every tear, every broken voice was proof of their strength. And then something changed. At the edge of the hall, a shadow moved. A figure stood apart from the others, taller, broader, different. At first, the people thought it was another guard, but then they saw his face. He was not one of them. His skin was pale, his eyes deep, his hair dark. He was a human, the only human on this planet. Most had forgotten he even lived among them, but tonight he stepped into the light. The crowd gasped, whispers spreading like waves. "The human," they said. "Why is he here?" The rulers narrowed their eyes, their lips curling into scornful smiles. To them, humans were weak, fragile, unimportant. This one had no armor, no weapon, nothing but his hands and his voice. And yet, the way he walked made the air grow heavy. Each step was slow but firm, echoing louder than the metal boots of the guards. Solara opened her eyes and saw him. Her heart skipped, confusion mixing with fear and hope. She had seen him once in the market, carrying heavy goods with ease. He had looked ordinary then, silent, unnoticed. But now there was something different in him, something dangerous, something unbreakable. The guards moved to block his path, lowering their spears. The human stopped only a step away from them, his face calm. Then he spoke, and his voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "Why is she punished?" he asked. The rulers laughed, their voices cruel and sharp. "She is punished because she broke the law," one of them said. "She spoke against us, she spoke against the order, and that is crime." "She broke no law," the human said, his tone strong but steady. "She only spoke truth, and truth is not a crime." The crowd stirred, hearts beating faster, hands tightening. For years they had wanted to say those words, but fear held them still. Now a stranger, an outsider, a human, said it for them. The rulers leaned back, their smiles fading into anger. "Leave, human," one of them hissed. "This is not your fight, not your world." But the human did not move, his dark eyes locked on Solara, and in that moment she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The chamber was silent. Every breath, every sound, every heartbeat waited for what would come next. The guards tensed, ready to strike. The rulers seethed with rage. Solara trembled above the deadly spears, and the human stood tall, one man against a throne of power. The hook had been set. The story was only beginning. The human appears. The human's voice still echoed in the great hall. It was calm but heavy, like thunder hidden in clouds. The crowd did not know what to feel, shock or fear. No outsider had ever spoken against the rulers. No one had ever dared. The guards tightened their grip on their spears, their sharp eyes fixed on him. The rulers leaned forward, their faces twisted in anger. They were not used to defiance, not from their own people, and certainly not from a human. "Take him out," one ruler ordered, his voice sharp as iron. The guards moved, two of them stepping closer, but the human did not step back. He stood tall, his arms loose at his side, but his presence filled the chamber. The people whispered to each other, "Why does he risk his life? He is only human. He will die." But some eyes in the crowd carried something else. Curiosity, even hope. Solara lifted her head weakly, her body trembling above the deadly spears. She did not understand. Why would a stranger fight for her? Why would a human who owed her nothing put himself in danger? Her lips trembled, but no words came out. The guards raised their spears, pointing them at the man's chest. "Leave now, outsider," one growled. "You do not belong here." The human's eyes shifted, cold and steady. "I will leave," he said, his voice strong. "When justice lives in this hall." The rulers laughed cruelly, their voices bouncing across the chamber. "Justice," one mocked. "Justice is what we say it is." The others nodded, their crowns glinting in the light. "If we say she is guilty, then she is guilty. If we say she must suffer, then she must suffer. That is the law." The human tilted his head slightly as though their words were strange. "That is not law," he said. "That is fear." The chamber grew colder. The words were simple, but no one had ever spoken them out loud. The crowd stirred, hearts pounding as if the human had broken invisible chains. The rulers' faces darkened. One slammed his hand against the arm of his throne. "Seize him," he commanded. At once, the guards stepped forward, their spears ready, but the human did not run. Instead, he moved toward Solara, one slow step after another. Every eye followed him. Each step was dangerous, each step closer to death. The guards blocked his way, their armor clashing. But the human did not strike. He simply kept moving. Oh. Spear point cut across his arm, leaving a line of blood. He did not flinch. He walked as if pain was nothing to him. The crowd gasped. They had seen many break at the sight of blood, but he walked on. Whispers rose again. "Is he mad? Is he stronger than he looks?" Solara's eyes widened, her fear mixing with awe. For the first time she saw not weakness in the human, but power, not power of weapons, not power of fear, but something else, something unshakable. He reached the edge of the spear-covered floor. Solara's breath caught in her throat. Her knees hovered above the deadly points, her body ready to collapse. The human looked at her and their eyes met. In that moment, the world around her disappeared. She saw no rulers, no guards, no crowd, only him. His eyes told her something words could not. That she was not alone. The rulers growled in anger. "Step back, human," one shouted. "You are nothing here, you are dust in our world." But the human smiled faintly, a smile not of joy but of certainty. "I am nothing, maybe," he said, "but I will not let her die." The guards charged, their boots striking like thunder. The crowd cried out, fear rising. But the human did not retreat. He raised his arms, catching the first spear shaft with his bare hands. Metal cut his skin, blood ran down his fingers, but he pushed it aside. The guard stumbled back, shocked. Another lunged, but the human turned, his body swift, his strike quick. The spear clattered to the ground. Gasps filled the hall. The rulers leaned forward, their scorn replaced by unease. This was not what they expected. Humans were supposed to be weak, fragile, afraid. But here stood one, bleeding, defying, refusing to bend. Solara's chest rose and fell rapidly. She felt hope burning inside her, fragile but alive. The crowd's silence began to crack. Someone whispered, "He is not weak." Another whispered, "He is fighting for her." And those whispers grew, spreading like sparks in dry grass. The rulers pounded their thrones, desperate to keep control. "Silence," one shouted, but their voices no longer carried the same weight. The people looked at the human who bled but stood strong, the human who dared when no one else would. Solara's tears fell, not of fear, but of something new. For the first time in her life, she felt the chains of fear loosen. For the first time, she believed change might be possible, all because of one man, one human, who refused to look away. The guards circled him, their weapons ready. The rulers whispered to each other, their calm broken, their eyes uncertain. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath, and in the center of it all the human stood tall, his shadow stretching long. He was only one man, but in that moment, he was more than. The air in the great hall grew heavy. The human stood near the edge of the spear-covered floor, his hands bleeding, his chest rising and falling slowly. Around him the guards circled like wolves, their spears ready to strike. Above, the rulers leaned forward on their golden thrones, anger twisting their faces. No one had ever stood against them in this place. Not until this night. The crowd held its breath, their voices trapped in their throats. They had seen many punished, many broken. But never had they seen resistance like this. One man, a human, standing firm against power that had ruled for generations. Solara's knees shook as she tried to hold herself above the deadly spears. Her pain was sharp, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. His presence was the only thing keeping her spirit alive. The tallest guard stepped forward, his armor gleaming. He raised his spear high and shouted, "Kneel, outsider, kneel before the rulers." The human turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting the guards. "I kneel before no cruelty," he said, his voice steady. The words struck the chamber. Like a hammer, the crowd gasped. The rulers' faces burned with rage. Another guard lunged, his spear aiming for the human's chest. The human moved quickly, faster than anyone expected. He caught the wooden shaft, twisted it, and snapped it against his knee. The sound echoed across the hall, a crack that carried more power than any roar. The guard stumbled back, staring at the broken weapon in disbelief. The crowd began to murmur, whispers mixing with awe. "He broke it with his hands. He fights them without fear." The rulers slammed their thrones, trying to drown the voices. "Silence," one of them thundered, but the people did not listen as quickly as before. The human stepped forward, closer to the spears, closer to Solara. Blood dripped from his hands, staining the floor, but he did not slow. He looked at her, and for a moment, his voice softened. "You will not die. Here," he said. Her heart skipped, her eyes wide. She did not know him, yet she believed him. The guards attacked again, two striking at once. The human shifted, one blow slicing his shoulder, another cutting across his ribs. Pain flashed through him, but his eyes stayed fierce. He struck back with nothing but his fists and strength. One guard crashed against the stone wall, another fell to his knees, his spear broken. The people gasped again, louder this time. Hope flickered in their hearts, fragile but growing. For so long they had bowed their heads, too afraid to resist. But here stood one who refused to bow, one who fought not for himself, but for someone else. The rulers rose from their thrones, robes flowing, their voices sharp. Stop him now," they shouted. But even as more guards rushed in, the human did not back away. Instead, he stepped onto the spear-covered floor. The crowd screamed, Solara's heart froze. The sharp points cut into his boots, into his flesh, blood dripping. But he stood tall, his body between Solara and death. The rulers stared, shocked that he would dare such madness. The crowd could not look away. This man, this human, bled before their eyes, but he did not bend. His voice rose again, carrying across the chamber like fire. "You call this justice," he shouted. "You call this law. But I call it chains, I call it fear." His words struck harder than his fists. Every ear heard, every heart trembled. The rulers snarled, "You are weak, human, you will die here." But the human shook his head, his blood falling on the spears. "Maybe I will die," he said, his voice steady. "But I will not die silent, and I will not let her die alone." Solara's eyes filled with tears, her breath shaking. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to stand for her. Not because of power, not because of gain, but because it was right. The people felt it too, their whispers rising louder. "He is not weak. He is stronger than them." Their voices spread like a storm, shaking the hall itself. The rulers looked at each other, for the first time showing unease. They had ruled through fear, but fear was slipping away, and all it took was one human standing against them. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to strike or step back. The rulers roared in anger, but their command no longer felt unbreakable. The human reached down, pulling at Solara's chains. Metal cut his palms, but he pulled harder, his strength fueled by fury. The chains groaned, and with one final wrench they snapped. The sound thundered through the hall, louder than any order. From the throne, Solara fell into his arms, weak and trembling but alive. The crowd erupted in shouts, some in fear, some in hope. The rulers screamed for silence, their voices drowned in the storm of voices rising against them. The human stood, Solara in his arms, his body bleeding, his eyes burning, and for the first time in generations, the people saw defiance not crushed, but standing tall. The night had begun with silence and fear, but now the hall shook with a different sound, the sound of change. The hall was no longer silent. The rulers shouted, their voices sharp, their commands desperate. The crowd roared with whispers, gasps, and rising anger, and at the center of it all stood the human. Holding Solara in his arms, blood dripping onto the spear-covered floor, the rulers pounded their thrones with fists of fury. "Guards! End this now!" one of them cried. But the guards hesitated. They had seen their brothers fall against the human's bare strength. They had seen his hands break chains, his body endure wounds that should have stopped him. For the first time, doubt entered their eyes. Solara's weak voice broke through the noise. You will die for me," she whispered, her breath trembling. The human looked down at her, his face calm even through the pain. "If I die," he said softly, "then I die for something true." His words were not loud, but they carried like a spark in dry wood. The crowd heard, and their hearts burned brighter. The tallest guard finally stepped forward, his armor shining under the crystal lights. He growled, lifting his spear, "If the rulers wish you dead, human, then you will die by my hand." The human placed Solara gently at the edge of the spear floor, out of immediate danger. Then he stood tall once more, facing the guard with nothing but his fists. The guard charged, his spear thrust forward. Like lightning, the human shifted, the spear grazing his side, blood flowing, but instead of falling, he seized the shaft and yanked with raw force. The guard stumbled, his balance broken. In one powerful move, the human smashed the spear against the stone floor, snapping it in two. The sound cracked across the hall, another symbol of defiance. The crowd cried out louder, some voices cheering. Now, the rulers' faces twisted, fear flickering behind their rage. They were losing control. The human turned, his chest bleeding, his voice rising once more. "You see," he called out to the people. "They call this justice. They call this law, but it is only chains. Do you not see how they feed on your silence, how they punish your voices?" The crowd stirred, their silence breaking into louder cries. Some shouted in agreement, others trembled in fear. But the air was changing. The rulers slammed their thrones again, their eyes glowing with fury. "Silence," they thundered, "or you will all share her fate." But the threat no longer carried the same weight. The crowd did not lower their eyes as quickly as before. Solara watched with tears streaming down her cheeks. She had been ready to die, ready to become another victim of cruel tradition. But now she saw the spark of something greater, a spark that might grow into a fire. The guards regrouped, 5 of them stepping forward in unison. They surrounded the human, their spears raised. The rulers sneered, confident again. "No man can stand against all," one hissed. But the human only clenched his fists tighter, his body straight even as blood ran down his arms. "I do not stand for myself," he said. "I stand for her, and for all of you." The words rang like steel. The crowd gasped, then shouted louder. "He stands for us," one voice cried, another followed. "He fights for truth." The ruler's eyes widened, panic mixing with rage. They could feel the ground shifting beneath them. The 5 guards charged at once, spears flashing. The human moved with speed born of desperation. He ducked under one strike, grabbed another spear, and pulled the guard forward. The man stumbled into his comrades, chaos breaking their formation. The human struck with his elbow, his knee, his fists. Each blow carrying raw power. Armor clattered, spears fell, blood spilled. But still he stood, wounded yet unbroken. The crowd's whispers became cries, and cries became shouts. "Fight them! Do not fear!" The ruler's commands were drowned in the rising storm of voices. The people no longer hid their anger. They had been silent for years, but now their silence cracked wide open. Solara crawled to her knees, her body weak but her eyes fierce. She reached for the chains still hanging from her wrists. The broken links gleamed in the light, a symbol of what had just changed. She raised them high for the crowd to see, her voice trembling but clear. "I was no criminal, I was punished for truth." The crowd roared louder, their fury turning toward the rulers. The rulers rose from their thrones, their robes flowing like shadows. "Enough," one bellowed. "You will all be crushed if you defy us." But the people no longer bowed. They shouted back, their courage building. The rulers saw it. The fear they once fed on was slipping from their grasp. The human stood among broken spears and fallen guards, his chest heaving, his body bloodied, but his spirit unshaken. He turned his gaze upward, meeting the ruler's furious eyes. "You rule by fear," he said, his voice steady. "But fear ends tonight." The chamber erupted, the people stamping the revelation. The chamber was shaking with voices. The people who once stood silent were now shouting, their fear cracking into anger. The rulers bellowed from their golden thrones, trying to drown the storm. But their words, once so heavy, now sounded weak. The human stood in the center, his body bleeding but his eyes sharp. Broken spears lay scattered around him. Guards groaned on the floor. Solara clutched the snapped chains in her hands, holding them high for all to see. The sight of broken chains struck the crowd harder than any weapon. For years they had believed the ruler's law was unbreakable. But tonight, one human had broken it with his own hands. The tallest ruler rose, his robe flowing like fire. "You fools," he shouted, his voice booming. "You think this man is your savior, but he is nothing. He is a liar. He is an outsider." His finger pointed at the human filled with venom. "Humans are weak. They are worthless. He is only here to bring you ruin." The crowd stirred uneasily, their courage tested by the sharp voice. But the human stepped forward, his shoulders straight. He lifted his voice strong and steady. "You call me weak. You call me nothing. And maybe I am. But I know this," he said. "She did not commit a crime. Her only crime was speaking truth." He turned slowly, his voice carrying. Across the hall, "Do you remember the farmers who vanished last winter accused of hoarding food? Do you remember the healers taken away because they spoke against the taxes? Do you remember the children forced to watch their mothers punished, though they did no wrong?" Each question struck like a blade, cutting through silence. The people gasped, heads turning, whispers spreading like wildfire. The rulers pounded their thrones, their eyes glowing with fury. "Lies," they cried. "All lies. He twists your minds." But the human did not stop. He raised his bloody hand pointing at Solara, her chains glinting. "She is proof that they punish not for crime but for fear. They fear her voice, they fear your voices, and so they silence you." Solara's weak voice rose beside him. "They took me because I spoke against them," she said, her words shaking but true. "They said my words would spread unrest. They said silence was peace, but it was only their peace, not ours." Her eyes swept the crowd, her chains lifted high. "And if they can do this to me, they can do it to any of you." The hall erupted, the people shouting louder. Some cried in rage, others in grief, remembering loved ones taken by false law. The rulers shouted back, their commands desperate. "Silence, silence, or you will all share her fate." But their threats no longer bent spines as they once did. The crowd's anger grew, rising like a tide against a crumbling wall. The human raised his voice again, stronger than before. "You see now, don't you? Their law is not law, their justice is not justice. They have ruled you through chains, through fear, through silence, but you are many, and they are few." The crowd's roar shook the very stones. Voices cried, "No more, no more." The rulers' faces turned pale behind their fury. They had lived their lives fed by obedience, but obedience was slipping from their grasp. The guards, still standing, shifted uneasily, their loyalty torn. They looked at their bleeding brothers on the floor, at the shouting people, at the human who stood unbroken, and for the first time, doubt entered their eyes. Solara clung to the human's arm, her strength barely holding her upright. Her voice rose again, trembling but clear. "They call us weak, but look," she cried. "Look how one man stands against them. Look how his truth is stronger than their chains." Her words struck deep, igniting the crowd's fury further. Mothers lifted their children high. Fathers raised their fists. The hall shook with voices united. The rulers screamed, their threats lost in the thunder of rebellion. The tallest ruler drew a dagger from his robe, his voice cutting through the noise. "If you follow him, you will all die," he hissed. He pointed the dagger toward Solara, his eyes blazing with hate. "If she lives, your voices rise, but if she dies, your hope dies with her." The human stepped in front of her, his body shielding hers. Blood ran down his chest, but his stance was iron. "You will not touch her," he growled, his voice low but powerful. The ruler sneered, "You cannot protect her forever, human. One day you will fall." The human's eyes burned, his voice steady. "Then I will fall standing, not kneeling." The crowd exploded with cheers, the ruler's threats drowned once more. The chamber trembled, stone dust falling from the ceiling as voices thundered. The people who once bowed now stood tall. The people who once feared now shouted. The revelation was complete. The truth had broken chains more deeply than any weapon. Solara leaned on the human, her tears falling freely. She whispered, "You gave them truth, and now they will never forget." The human did not answer, his gaze fixed on the rulers. But in his silence, his defiance spoke louder than any words. The ruler's empire of fear had cracked, and the people knew it. The night that began with one girl's punishment now burned with the fire of rebellion, and the rulers for the first time trembled. The hall was no longer only a chamber of fear. It had become a storm of voices, of anger, of hope. The rulers shouted for silence, but no one listened. Their power, once unshakable, now trembled in their own hands. The human stood bleeding, Solara leaning against him, her broken chains shining like proof of truth. The people's cries grew louder. "No more, no more." The rulers rose from their thrones, their faces pale, under the flicker of crystal light. "Kill them both," the tallest ruler ordered, his voice shrill with fury. "Kill the human, kill the girl, and end this rebellion before it begins." Dozens of guards rushed forward, their spears flashing. Boots thundered across the floor, the sound like drums of war. The people gasped, fear pulling at their courage. Would one human be enough? Could he survive against so many? The human set Solara carefully against the wall, his voice calm but firm. "Stay here," he said. "Do not fear. You are free now." She wanted to protest, to say he would die, but his eyes silenced her. There was no fear in them, only resolve. He turned, his fists clenched, his body straight, though blood ran down his arms and chest. The first guard lunged, spear aimed for his heart. The human twisted, the spear tip grazing his ribs, and he struck with his fist. The guard fell, gasping for breath. Another came from behind, but the human turned quickly, driving his elbow back. Armor cracked, the guard collapsed, but more kept coming, wave after wave. The people shouted in panic. Some cried out his name, though they had never spoken to him. Others shouted in anger, "Fight! Fight!" The rulers leaned forward, their eyes burning, their teeth clenched. They expected him to fall quickly, broken under the weight of numbers, but still he stood. Still he fought. Each strike of his fists was heavy, each movement filled with raw will. Spears slashed his skin. His blood painted the floor, yet his body moved like fire, unstoppable. One guard after another fell, groaning on the stone, and the people watched with eyes wide. There, fear turning into something new, belief. Solara pressed her hand to the wall, forcing herself to stand, her body weak but her spirit burning. She raised the broken chains again, shouting with all her voice, "They cannot break us if we rise together." Her cry carried into the crowd. The people erupted, their voices shaking the walls. The rulers slammed their fists on their thrones. Silence them all," one screamed. But the people were no longer silent. They surged forward, some climbing onto the stone benches, some throwing stones, some grabbing broken pieces of wood and metal. Fear was gone. Anger had taken its place. The human caught another spear, twisted it free, and hurled it across the floor. It struck the ground before the rulers' thrones, the sound echoing like thunder. He raised his voice, raw and fierce. "Your time is over," he shouted. "You ruled with fear, but fear ends tonight." The crowd roared back, louder than the rulers' voices, louder than the guards' boots. "Tonight, tonight," they cried. The guards faltered, their lines breaking under the weight of defiance. Some dropped their weapons, backing away from the storm they could not stop. The rulers' faces turned pale, their power slipping like sand through their fingers. Solara stumbled forward, her hands gripping the human's arm. Her voice cracked but strong. "You are not alone anymore," she told him. And she was right. The people were no longer watching in silence. They were moving, rising, fighting. A young man in the crowd leapt forward, seizing a fallen guard's spear. He shouted, "For freedom," and struck against the next guard. Others followed, mothers, fathers, even children threw stones. The hall became chaos, but it was chaos of rebellion. The rulers screamed, crush them all," but their words were drowned. The human fought on, his strength failing but his will burning bright. Solara stayed close, helping him when she could, her presence like fire in his veins. Every time he stumbled, he rose again. Every time he bled, he fought harder. The people's courage grew with every heartbeat. They no longer saw rulers on thrones, they saw liars trembling. They no longer saw themselves as slaves, but as voices rising, and the rulers knew. They could not put this storm back in chains. The tallest ruler raised his dagger, his eyes blazing. "If I must," he shouted, "I will kill her myself." He leapt from his throne, dagger high. The crowd screamed. Solara froze. But before the blade could fall, the human caught the ruler's wrist, his grip iron, his voice steady. "No more." The dagger clattered to the ground. The great hall shook with thunder that was not from the sky. It was the thunder of people's voices, a storm that could not be stopped. The rulers had screamed, had threatened, had ordered, but their power was breaking. And at the center of it all stood the human, his body wounded, his blood dripping, but his spirit unbroken. Solara leaned on him, her chains broken, her tears shining. She could barely stand, but her heart was burning with hope. The people roared her name now, shouted it like a banner. "Solara, Solara," they cried. No longer a victim, she was a symbol. The tallest ruler stumbled backward, his dagger on the floor, his eyes wide with fear. He had never seen the people rise like this, never seen them disobey. The human's grip had stripped him of his power, not only in body, but in spirit. He tried to shout again, but his voice cracked, his words drowned by the storm of rebellion. Other rulers clung to their thrones, their crowns heavy on their trembling heads. They whispered to each other in panic. "What do we do? They will tear us apart." But no answer came, for fear had turned its face toward them now. The guards, once loyal, stood frozen. Some had dropped their spears, others hid behind their shields. They saw the people rising. They saw their rulers shrinking, and they knew the tide had turned. The human raised, his voice once more strong even through his pain. "Look at them. he cried, pointing to the rulers. They called themselves your masters, your law, your justice, but look at them now. They tremble before you because they know their lies are broken. The people roared in answer. They surged forward, no longer afraid. Stones, sticks, even bare hands struck against the guards who still resisted. The thrones shook under the cries of the crowd. The rulers shouted for order, but order was gone. Fear no longer belonged to the people. It belonged to those who had ruled. Solara lifted, her broken chains high, her voice rising above the storm. "These chains are not mine alone," she shouted. "They are yours too, every one of you, and tonight they break." The crowd erupted, their fists raised, their voices like fire. The rulers paled, their power slipping like sand. The human stepped closer to the thrones, his eyes locked on the rulers. "You can no longer rule with fear," he said. "Your time is done." One ruler cried out, "Then what, human? Will you rule us?" The human shook his head, his voice calm. "I did not come to rule. I came to stand to show you that fear can be broken." Solara touched his arm, her eyes shining. "You gave them courage," she whispered. The human looked at her but said nothing, his silence heavier than words. For in that silence was truth. He had not come for power. He had come for something greater. The crowd surged again, pushing against the guards. The rulers screamed, retreating up the steps behind their thrones. One crown fell to the floor, rolling down into the crowd. The people seized it, raising it high, a symbol of victory. The rulers' faces drained of color, their thrones no longer safe. Solara stood tall now, her weakness forgotten in the fire of the moment. She turned to the people, her voice strong. "Tonight we stand. Tomorrow we rise," she cried. The crowd answered, their chant shaking the hall. "Rise, rise, rise." The rulers fled through hidden doors, their robes trailing like shadows. Their power crumbled behind them, their fear heavy in their steps. The guards who remained dropped their weapons, falling to their knees before the people. The hall belonged no longer to the rulers, but to those who had been silent for too long. Human lifted Solara into his arms, carrying her down the steps of the spear floor. The people cleared a path, their eyes wide with respect and awe. No one had ever seen such courage, such defiance. He was only one man. Yet he had broken the unbreakable. Solara looked at him, her tears falling. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you save me?" The human's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because someone had to," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of mountains. The crowd followed them out of the hall, their chant still rising. The city streets filled with voices, with footsteps, with fire. Fear had fallen and rebellion had begun. But in the shadows above, unseen eyes watched. Messengers ran to distant towers, carrying word of the uprising. The rulers who fled were not gone, only hiding. And beyond the stars, greater powers stirred. For the humans' defiance had not only shaken one hall, it had sent ripples across the empire. The night burned with freedom, but the dawn promised war. And the story of one human who stood against cruelty was only at its beginning.